So I'm going to do a bit of a video today going through email templates in Marketo and the email editor in Marketo. I've had a couple of requests from people asking to do a little bit of a deep dive into this sort of stuff. So what I've done today is I've set up an email template in Marketo with a fake brand with some sort of best practice breakdowns of how I normally use an email template in Marketo. And I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the things that you should expect to be seeing, some of the functionalities you should expect to have if you've got a well-built template. The idea is that this video should hopefully be helpful if you are looking at getting a custom template built, wondering what next steps might be, wondering what some of the functionalities are that should be available to you in the email editor. So I've got the template picker screen up here right now, which you should be familiar with if you've created emails in Marketo. Chances are when you create an email, this is one of the first screens you see. And the options you've got here are what are called Marketo starter templates. There's a bunch of different options, all set up with generic fake brands, different structures, different layouts, all sorts of things here. You generally won't find that you want to use the starter templates for very long. There is a reason why they're called starter templates, and it's because they're designed to start you off. They're limited in their functionality. A lot of them have rendering issues because they're a little bit old. Really, if you're getting more advanced in Marketo, you should be investing in a custom template. Once you get to a point where you know what your needs are, you know what your brand look and feel is, you know what email functionality you're looking for, at that point you really want to look at investing in a custom template, because everyone's needs as far as email templates are going to be different. You're going to have different preferences for layout, for structure, for an editor functionality, whether some things should or should not be editable. No one brand's needs are the same there. So it doesn't make sense for Marketo to try to cater to everyone's needs in here. It's really just to start you off. If you jump into the My Templates tab, that's where you can access custom templates. And I've set up one here. Just as a starting point to kick us off for the purposes of this video. But My Templates, starter templates, those are the options you have there. So to kick us off, I'm just going to have a quick scan through the template that I've set up and show you what all of the overall design looks like for what I've done. So I've just got a fake brand with generic colors, nothing special here. All of the text is placeholder text, all of the images are placeholder images. But you can see we've got a pre-header section, a header section with a logo, image section, headings, text, buttons, different divider sections. I've got a line divider and a generic just blank space divider. And then also some different content combos, different arrangements, some pretty funky looking stuff that looks pretty weird at this point, but I will show you what that turns into in the editor. And basically just a bunch of different layout options through here and a tokenized footer. So this is what I'm going to be walking you through in the email editor over here. So when we jump in, for this starting point, I haven't got any modules set to appear by default, but that is a functionality you can do. Within your email editor, you can say show all modules by default in this dashboard area, show none of them, show a certain number of them. You can customize that completely, and that can save you having to put some sections in multiple times. Now, if I jump into the modules tab, this is where you get to see a little bit of how all of my different sections actually break down into individual modules. I can't really stress highly enough how important it is to be incredibly considerate about the way that you break these down, where your modules start and finish, how you combine them, even the order that you put them in your template can be something to really consider, can make your life a lot easier or a lot more difficult. You'll see the way that I've got this one broken down is it starts off with a lot of very short, very simple modules. These are kind of the most commonly used, most key, and definitely the starting building blocks of really all of the emails that I build. So for this example, I've got a pre-header that's got some social icons in it, a logo banner, an image banner, some headings, the body text, all of those buttons, the things that I showed you before. You can now see how they split apart. But you can also see in here how some of those combined sections are actually whole modules and not broken down into individual components. And all of those different options all the way down to the footer and the post footer. The key things to think about here in terms of how you break things down is how do you actually use modules. Have a look at some of the emails that you've built recently and what are some of the common combinations, the common layouts that you've used across them. Really, I can create everything in this individual module just using a combination of all of these things. But if I wanted to do that, I'd need to drag all of those individual components in by themselves, and that becomes quite complicated. So instead of having to do this, I can do this. Done. Now I know that doesn't look exactly the same, but you get the point, right? Where it could take my users a couple of minutes to be able to get all of the right modules in, get them all set up the right way in the right order, and then if you're using the same concept multiple times across a single image, have to repeat that consistently. In this example, I've dragged it in once and it's done. And if I wanted to, I could drag it in again and it would be done just as easily, but also the two of them are consistently styled that way, and I don't have to go and double check that I've done all the padding exactly the same and that everything is consistent. So it might seem like a duplication, but it's actually a real massive efficiency boost for your team to do things that way. So to get us started, I'm going to just drop in some base structure modules into the canvas area. Starting off with the pre-header section, the logo banner, basically just working my way down through all of the module options for the pieces that I feel like I want today. Okay, so here we go. I've got a fairly basic email set up here with some combos of some of the basic sections and some of the combined modules from my template. What I'm going to do now is basically dive into some of these modules and show you some of the functionality that I've got set up in these. So we've covered off modules at this point. The next two things I'm going to focus on while we work through the modules themselves is elements and variables. Now, again, if you've worked through the editor, you'll probably be familiar with these even if you don't know them by name, but they'll come up quite a bit as we go through here. Elements are, most commonly you'll see things like rich text, so anything that you can double click on and it pulls up a WYSIWYG editor, that's a rich text element. But also images, if you can double click on an image and it brings up the image pop-up that you can fill in, that's an image element. Your variables are what show up on the right hand side menu with different drop down fields or values that you can enter in. Those are your variables. Two really key components of an email template if it's well built with tons of different functionality. So we're going to go through some of the core examples of those in here. All right, kick us off, I'm going to dive into image elements, which if I double click on this image here, you'll see a pop-up that shows up. If that pop-up shows up, you are dealing with an image element, and you've got a bunch of options here for working with something from an external URL, uploading from your computer, or picking something existing from Design Studio. And you've also got some options here for populating your alt text, your link URL, and updating or adding any styles that you want to. Hot tip, I find this really helpful. Placeholder.com, really useful tool that you can use in your email or your landing page templates. It's just that standard via.placeholder.com/ and then you can enter the dimensions of whatever image you want it to be, and it'll populate into wherever you embed it with these little grey images with the dimensions written in. For templates, I find this incredibly helpful because what it does is it gives your users explicit information on exactly what the dimensions of the image that's supposed to go into that section are. And it helps avoid you getting missized images. One thing to note as well, most of you should be doing this at this point. Images in your emails should really be double the size at which they display. So this particular email is 620 pixels wide. That means that any image that is the full width of the email should be 1240 pixels wide. The way I've got this email template set up is that the height is completely flexible, so it can be 1240 by 700 like it is here, but it could be by 800, it could be by 350. Doesn't matter, the template will respond to that accordingly, but whatever you want it to display at should be double that. There's some really great posts around the place as to exactly how to do that and exactly why, but basically on Retina displays it'll look blurry if you don't. Double, exactly double. So in this pop-up, we can see the URL for the image. I can replace that with another URL directly if I want to. I've got a blank space to enter my alt text. Make sure you're entering alt text. It is really important and really beneficial to any users who are opening your emails that have visual impairments, but also anyone who's opening it in a system that disables images by default. It's really helpful if you are populating your alt text and not letting it just default to the name of the image file, because that usually is awful. You can also see I've got my link URL option here, and that currently this looks a little bit weird. I will explain in a second why it looks that way, but you'll also see I've got a UTM down through there automatically. Again, I'll explain in a second why it's done this way. And then you'll also see some of the style rules down here. This is all set in my template. I'm generally not going to fuss with this, but if you're in a situation where you might want to, you can. You can upload an image from your computer here if you want to. Generally not something that I do. It annoys me that you can't choose which folder the image goes into. So for me, I normally upload all of the images I'm going to use in an email in bulk into Design Studio, and then I'll go in and select them from here. So that's the image element. Now down below it, few things. Since I've got the image highlighted up here, you'll also notice that there's some things down here that have turned blue. What that means is that this element is using these variables. And when we jumped in here before and you could see the link URL looked slightly weird, the key things that we'll notice that are different here is this $ squiggly bracket image dash link 1, and then at the end we've also got same structure for UTM campaign. Those bits of text are variable references effectively, and you can think of them very similarly to tokens. Basically what it means is that whatever value I have in this variable is going to populate here, and then whatever value I have in this variable, which currently is the program name token, will populate at the end here. These different variables are divided into local and global variables. A local variable means that it is set for this module and only this module. So if that variable is used multiple times throughout the email, if I was to duplicate this module, changing the image link for the first version will not change the value in the second version because they're local. You can change them and it won't affect the other one. But a global variable is a variable that is always the same value no matter where it is referenced in the email. So when I set my UTM campaign in this module, it will change it for all modules. I really like controlling UTMs this way because it means that you get total control over making sure that they're accurate across all of the email. The only time it ever changes is if you're putting a hyperlink into the text and that hyperlink wasn't there in the template. But I've got it built into my template that all of my UTMs are built in. They're all already there. They're all structured. For me, across all of the campaigns that I do, the only UTM variable that changes is the campaign, and for us we always use program name, so I just populate it with the program name token here. And if for any reason I want to add any other detail into there or change it, I can do so. It's there, it's accessible, but 9 times out of 10 I don't touch it. So it saves a lot of time, means that your UTMs pretty consistently stay accurate throughout. One thing that's worth noting is if you do select an image from Design Studio and you have an alt text or a link URL populated by default, it will overwrite those and blank them out. So if you want to keep them, if you are using local variables in order to populate some of those values, you'll want to make sure that you copy that before you... I'm just going to chuck in this picture of Tango, thanks Joe, and add it back into there and type in your best Doge alt text. There we go. So that's image variables. Alright, so next up I'm going to look at rich text elements, which if I click into this heading section, you'll see it's got a little dotted line around it, and if I double click, a WYSIWYG pops up. So that just means I'm working with a rich text element. Standard WYSIWYG editor, you've got all of your editing functionalities here. You can insert tokens, you can add hyperlinks, and you can also click the HTML button to see what the code is that you're dealing with and make changes directly into the code if you want to. As a general rule of thumb, personally, I tend to make most of my changes in the HTML. That's largely just because I'm comfortable with it and then I know exactly what it's doing to my code. But you don't necessarily have to work that way. The key thing you want to be aware of here is that if you are bringing text in from an external source rather than just typing it in, if you're copying it across from a text editor of some kind, you'll want to be careful to make sure that you're not bringing in external styling unintentionally. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can paste it into something that strips out any external styling and then bring it in. So if you're working with a editor like Sublime Text or even Notepad, that generally works. But in my experience, the safest way to do it, and the way I generally do it, is I will paste my copy straight into the HTML view, add in any extra styling and any line breaks that I need to, and then work from the WYSIWYG once I've made those changes. It's not necessarily the most user-friendly way to work, but it tends to be the least error-prone. If I'm just typing stuff in by hand, then I'll totally do it within the text editor, within the WYSIWYG editor itself. But if I'm pasting, personally, I do it from the HTML. So there we go. There's some really cool options that you can start to utilize from a variables perspective in here. So you'll see I've got my local variables on the right hand side here. So one of the types of variables that you can use is a list variable, and a list variable translates into a drop down like this. And one of the things that I've got set up in this template is the ability to control alignment using a drop down using a list variable. So I can, with the click of a button, I can change the alignment of this heading from left to center or to right. There we go, without having to do any editing in the WYSIWYG. Not a major deal for a module that is just a heading section, but when you're working with larger modules, that can be really helpful to be able to do at the click of a button without having to go into all of the individual sections. You'll also see I've got some color variables here, so I'm controlling the grey background, the white background, and the color of the font using color variables. Another really easy thing to set up, and you can update and change it however you like. The third one I'll show you, which is probably one of my favorite features, is controlling your padding using variables. In this, particularly if you've got a lot of modules like this where they're broken down quite granular, and you can combine them in any number of ways, you may want to pad things differently depending on the way that you're using them in any given scenario. So I always set up all of my padding as number variables. So you'll see here we've got different values for bottom and top. And in this example, I've got everything on a 1 step. But but you can set things up so that they always jump up in increments of 5 or increments of 10. So one place here where I immediately feel like I want more padding is right below this button, because there's nothing but a gap underneath it. And I'm going to jump in now and increase that bottom padding to 50. And once it takes a second to think about it, boom, more padding. Really easy to do, doesn't require any HTML knowledge. Great way to use number variables. If I jump back into that now, moving on from the rich text elements, I am a massive fan of having whole modules that are just buttons and using a lot of local variables to control the way that your button is styled. Buttons are often one of those things that you want to change quite frequently on a dime, and they're also a really complicated thing to code. To get them built to work really consistently across as many different clients as you can takes a lot of work. If I jump in quickly, you'll see this thing is a bit of a mess. There's quite a lot of code going on here, and some of it's VML, which can be a little bit of a nightmare to work with. Basically, you don't want people jumping into that button to edit it if they don't know what they're doing. So giving them as much control as you can outside of the editor, outside of the rich text editor, I should say, is going to be helpful. For me, I always still leave the button as a rich text editable element, because if I or one of my users who is confident with HTML want to go in there and make a change to the code, you can do that without having to go into the editor. So I still like to make it available there, but leave most of the things editable with local variables. And you'll see now that I've got the button selected, anything that's a variable used by the button is highlighted in blue, including the global variable for the UTM campaign. But I've got the hyperlink that the button is pushing to here as a variable. For me, I always ask people to not include the UTM there, because I keep the UTM automatically built into the code itself. Also got the option to edit the text. Here again, we can see that drop down to change the alignment of the button. So I can make it left aligned, right aligned, center aligned, whatever I want. And in this example, which is a slightly more complex example, I've also got a bunch of different color options here, because this is a button that's set up to allow me to use a gradient if I want to. So if I jump in and change this color here, you'll see this changes from being a flat button to a gradiated button, and I can go in and change those colors to whatever I want. There you go. So now we've got a gradient button, which, for some brands that might be something you're looking for. So you can control that through local variables if you want to. The option is there. Again, padding, all there for you. So if I jump in now into this module that has all of these elements combined, you'll see there's a lot more options. Everything is broken down into individual elements. If I don't want any of these, say I'm in a situation where I don't need a disclaimer here, I can just clear that. And while this will create a little box in there at the moment, that'll collapse away as soon as you preview, and it doesn't add any extra padding. Really helpful. And we've still got a lot of those local variables that you'll now be familiar with, but just combined. So it does look a little bit bigger and more complicated, but once you know how it works, they're really all quite simple. So what I'm going to show you now is an example of how you can combine a lot of those features to start doing some slightly more complicated modules in the system that might look weird to start with, but ultimately let you do some fairly complicated stuff without developer support, but also in a way that is pretty consistent in the way that it displays across lots of clients. And this example looks really weird in the editor when you get started, but what it helps to do is bypass a key client rendering issue that you'll come across a lot, which is that background images don't display in all clients. So while this looks really weird right now, if you forget about the fact that it's 4 separate images and pretend it's one, what it actually is basically just a box on top of a background image. So what I'm going to show you is how you can do that using a slightly more complicated module setup without actually using a background image and thus bypassing that rendering issue. So If I jump in here, you'll see we've got a pretty long list of variables going on here. Again, it looks kind of weird to start with, and it looks a little bit overwhelming, but once you understand the rules, it's not too complicated. And basically what that lets you do is turn a module that initially looks like this into a module that looks like this instead. So they look completely different between the original view from the template and the completed view. Obviously it's still placeholder text, but you know what I mean. It looks like a text box over a background image. You cannot tell that these are individual components broken out when actually these are all individual sections. You cannot tell. And you can also build these sorts of things in such a way that they scale pretty nicely on mobile. It's not necessarily the best example photo here for this, but you can do this in a bunch of different ways so that it does actually scale quite nicely. And in this example, because I've got it set up with all of the widths being variables, you can do this in a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different images. You could have it just be the top and one side, or the top and both sides, or the top and the bottom, or there's a bunch of different ways that you can apply it. You can change the widths of sections. You could have this text box be 50% of the width or 80% of the width. At the moment I've got it as 78%. There's a ton of different ways that you can apply this just by breaking things up in different ways and using variables to your control. Again, this is a slightly more advanced way of working, but it can be really helpful because it does prevent you from needing dev resource to set these up once you've got them initially built. So that's just a neat example of a more advanced way that you can use some of these techniques. Alright, so I'm back in now with a slightly more basic email setup with all of my kind of basic components from logo all the way down through to footer. Other thing I really wanted to show you is some of the basic ways of working in the email editor that can be really helpful because there's a bunch of different ways to do things. So to start with, one thing that I'm embarrassed to say how long it took me to discover is that this little doodacky here will collapse all of your sender details from the top, giving you a much bigger canvas to work with. Really helpful for just giving you a little bit more space, good one to know. Hopefully everyone's aware of this as well, but you can also switch between desktop and mobile view, click of a button there. Another good thing to be aware of. You can drag and drop the order of components from the sidebar over here. If you just drag, I've just chucked my header all the way down to the bottom. I can hit it up to the top, move things around at the click of a button, just drag them very easily. You can also right click on sections from here and have quite a few options. You can move things up or down as well as drag and dropping. Really helpful to know as well that you can rename sections. So if you've got one module multiple times or you want to rename things in any individual email according to what's in that module, you can do that. You can also obviously delete or duplicate. Just be careful because those two are very close together and I'm forever accidentally clicking the wrong one. Those are the options that you've got in the sidebar here. Obviously you'll notice that as you go through it'll hover over, it'll create a dotted line, hover over whichever one you've actually got highlighted. If we jump into the canvas itself, you'll see that things change depending on where you're hovering when you click. So if I right click on the logo banner section while I'm over the editable area of it, it gives me edit, clear content, make dynamic, enable content AI. It gives me a few options there. But if I hover outside of the editable area and right click, it gives me a different range of options, more in line with the options that are available in that sidebar. I can't drag and drop from this side though, only from over here in the sidebar. If I click here as well, I get all of the global variables throughout my whole email available here, and that lets me set them wherever I want without having to find which module in the email is actually utilizing those variables in order to edit them. You've got your dynamic tab here. If you've got any dynamic content in the email, it'll be visible there. Obviously, you've got your modules tab there, so you can go through and pick any of your modules. You can also, at the bottom here, access the text version of your email. Too few people do this. It's still really valuable to go and update the text version of your email. It's a really good practice to go and do it. It's worth noting that generally you'll find that things don't populate consistently between the two, especially if you're using variables heavily. You'll see in this example, because I use variables to control the copy and the URLs for my buttons, they populate with these little squiggly token references, variable references, which you may have seen before. Those do not actually render properly from the text version. So if you want your text version to actually be functional and you're using variables heavily, chances are you may need to be doing a fair bit of manual work in here. Email settings at the top, so you've got all of your options here. These are all fairly self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just be aware that they are here and you should be editing them as appropriate, especially the pre-header. You don't want to forget that one. And you've also got all of your email action drop downs from here, so you can edit the code. Do just be careful with that, because if you edit outside of editable areas, you will break the email from the template. So you do want to be careful there. The main thing I'm usually using this for is to send samples. Okay, and hopefully that was helpful. The idea is basically to just go through some of the functionality that's available to you in the editor, show you some of the ways that it can be used, and hopefully give you some ideas on how you might want to apply it. The key takeaways I'd say is just have a think about how your modules should be broken down, how you normally use things, what things you do and don't want to be editable, and start figuring out how maybe you can tweak your template in order to work best for you. If any questions have been raised out of this, I'm more than happy to answer them. Feel free to chuck a comment down below or flick us an email at The Automation Geeks, reach out to me on LinkedIn or find me on the Marketo community. More than happy to answer any questions. But other than that, ka kite anō and happy automating.